And we're live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another response video to Prime Minister's questions. I really need to come up with some kind of name. Dead air. Fantastic. Today's PMQs is actually relevant to what you in the chat, Furry Kitten, have written. Food banks are going to crop up, yes. Due to time... Try again. I'm not mundane Matt, I don't have to do this to start again. Due to time constraints, I wasn't able to watch the whole of PMQs, but I did hear a few things here and there, along with the initial questions, which I have got plenty of sources for, and we will go through relevant cases and claims made, and there are plenty of fact checks. So austerity is the focal point, but also a number of contradictions that I hadn't really considered before, which are quite interesting. Things the Prime Minister says that don't add up, or make very little sense, and that's going to be a key point. Oh, wow, we're buffering on my tablet already. We shouldn't be. Let me check. Nope, it says running fine. It must be just my tablet playing up. My bad. I need to get that checked. So chat, let's see. Hello to Furry Kitten, myself, Jake, Anne, Serene, Grant, Daniel, Swan, Godiva, and Tiger Lily. Hello. And Perfectly Faded Delusions. Okay, to answer your question, I don't know why. I think it's a very interesting topic, and it's right, actually, a point made by Furry Kitten at the start, in fact, was about the fact that there are more food banks and people are being encouraged to use them. I think it depends on how you... Oh, it's quite... How to articulate this? It's available. Yes, you may need it or want it. Others then will obviously evaluate whether or not you are someone that fits the criteria. But some can just milk it anyway. They have a way around that. Oh dear. You know, I can't actually articulate a thought for it, and I think I'd need a night to think about it. I know there are... Hello, Joe. There are people who would abuse a system because it's there, but there are others who need it. But then, of course, the whole... Oh, fuck off with YouTube Premium on the tablet. No one needs that shit. I'm not going to pay you for that crap. No, Puckbaker. So yeah, anyway, we'll just dive in. I'll have to scroll back. Oh dear, oh dear. I'm going to try and find the bit where she doesn't talk about shit. Give me a second. I do apologise, my mouse is being gay again. Ah, here we are.
Is in this house.
Nope, I haven't actually pulled it up. That would help. There we go. Professionalism, everyone. Oh, and before we even start, actually, as I told a few other people, I've got a new computer sat next to me, and I should, in theory, be getting the new monitors tomorrow, along with a new mouse. I had one mouse that lasted 5 years, no problems. But in the last 3 months, I've gone through 3 mouses, or mice, that have been even more expensive, but shit. Even though the reviews were all good, you know, I did my research, but apparently this X08 is absolute dog shit, so it causes my mouse to glitch, and yeah. But yeah, if it does arrive, if the monitors do early enough, I'll be able to set up the computer, and it should make things a lot easier with streaming with 2 monitors. It's more powerful than this laptop, vastly more powerful, so it should make things a lot easier than me having to constantly look at my tablet over the side here. That's right, 90-degree angle from my laptop, because if I have it anywhere near the microphone, it frazzes it out.
So I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Paul Sweeney.
2 teenage brothers from my constituency, Somer and Arib, have lived in Glasgow since the youngest was 5 years old. They are now naturalised Glaswegians, but they live in constant fear of deportation to a country where they fled in fear of their lives. Their school friends at Springburn Academy rallied to their cause by launching a petition that has now been signed by over 90,000 people and was recently presented to the Home Office by the school and the moderator of the Church of Scotland. However, this action...
Before we go any further, Christian Church. That is an important piece of information.
...has been met with callous indifference.
Citation needed.
When the leader of the opposition met the children in August, he was appalled by the lack of compassion shown by the Home Office towards these boys.
I've got an article linked, not yet. I have an article I can look at that was tweeted out by this MP, Mr. Sweeney, and in it details the two children's case, and this is quite important because it's a piece of information that's often overlooked. Now, the Prime Minister will make us a little statement on that, and the article does cover that. But I want to talk about the kids. You see, they moved to Glasgow from Faisalabad in 2012 after their father was subjected to death threats from Islamic extremists due to their Christian faith. Christians in Pakistan, in an Islamic country, getting abuse. How very telling. Now, the article goes on to talk about how the Christian church has treated them here, and obviously how the community rallied to get a petition going. It has got over 90,000 signatures on it. It's quite impressive. But there's nothing to really indicate how the Home Office treated them past not acknowledging much. It also mentions something later about the... where is it? I've got to scroll down and find it because it's actually quite... here we go. A quote from a chaplain in Ordinary to... Okay, I'm going to quote this title. Mrs. Brown, a chaplain in Ordinary to the Queen. I have no idea what that title means, but it sounds really boring. I mean, a chaplain sounds amazing if you're a Space Marine fan, but in Ordinary? I don't know what that means. If you in the chat know, please let me know. Oh, excuse me. The quote reads, we urge the UK government to examine the case again and recognise the Pakistan-wide threat that the family faces. Christian problem. Islam is remarkably intolerant. Other religions are as well. I won't deny that. Hell, look at China at the moment with Muslims in China. Apparently there are camps. That's pretty fucking shit. So yeah, religious persecution still exists. But the fact that the MP didn't recognise that element is quite telling. Or didn't mention it. The quick quote finishes that Summer and Arib are flourishing, and despite the stresses the family is under and the conditions which they live, deem Scotland their home. It's quite a nice way to throw shade at your country, the country you call your home. Because apparently the conditions you live in are clearly below par. Because of course you are thriving in Pakistan. Do they have toilet paper there? I'm just saying, I know Scotland looks like it's been pebble dashed, and generally it's worse than Haiti. But surely you're not going to use the conditions of living in Scotland, which is your home, which Mrs. Brown's doing a fantastic job here of crapping on the goodwill of Scotland, which has quite an interesting immigration thing with policy. They've welcomed in so many more thousands, but of course at the same time we can't be welcoming about that. At the same time we must also crap on ourselves for not working hard enough. I've heard of families in Scotland who've been, and I say families, migrant families who've come to Scotland and then been separated to such an extent that they are the only family in a town or village that speaks their language, that are their own faith. And people then write articles complaining about this. And I think most people in the chat, you'd agree, it is then your job, not just the communities should welcome you, of course, and if they have, they've done their part. It is now your part to integrate. These kids have integrated. There's no denying it. There's a video accompanying this article. I've watched it. I will link it afterwards. They clearly have settled into Scotland. And the government has failed them in this case. I don't know all the details. The article does not give all the details. But religious persecution is quite an important thing. If you know someone is going to be because of it, then of course you want to protect them. If they're contributing towards your society, you should especially want to look out for them, not just because of the religious persecution. So let's hear the... two other little things before we continue. Firstly, the UK Parliament channel finally uploaded to their own bloody channel on time this week. So congratulations to you. Why have you got a wheelchair in the chat? This isn't a kumite. And I'm not in a wheelchair. At least I don't recall being in one. I mean, I've used one to wheel around when I've been... when my sister was in hospital once, but other than that... there was another thing. It was important. Clearly not important enough because it's gone from my head. Thank you to the wheelchair person in the chat. Goat and dog. Let's just continue. I'll remember it in a minute.
Have been kept in limbo for years. Will the Prime Minister now review this case and meet with these boys to witness at first hand what life is like at the sharp end of this government's hostile environment?
And in reference to the hostile environment, quote, Mr. Sweeney has actually done it on a few occasions in the past. The difference is, the case he now references has a new Home Secretary who has denounced that turn of phrase. He has openly denounced it and said he'd prefer the term compliant. Which is okay, I guess. I mean, I don't need if I'm old, I'd need a Zimmer Frames Viper Sword. And I have one. That it was given to me when I was 21. It's coloured in rainbows and it's fabulous. Now this man, he brings up hostile environment with previous cases before. He had a leg to stand on with the previous cases. This one, not so much. It is no longer hostile environment, and yet it is continually referenced by the Labour Party. They really need to stop.
Prime Minister! That every case in relation to people's right to stay here in the United Kingdom is looked at extremely carefully, and I will certainly ensure that the Home Office looks again at this case.
Sir David Amis!
Oh, this is a pointless question. Let's move on. This question actually pissed me off because it was just the most obvious plant. Mouse is being gay. Come on. Right.
And I'd like to join my honourable friend in welcoming this new jazz centre, and I note once again the bid he has put in relation to Southend.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do join the Prime Minister in thanking the former head of the Civil Service, Jeremy Hayward, for his public service. Wish him well in his recovery, and I have to say, in my conversations with him, what an impressive, well-informed and dedicated public servant he is. And I really do hope he gets through this very difficult condition he's in at the present time. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says austerity is over. The Conservative leader of Walsall Council says austerity is alive and kicking. Who's right?
Okay, this is in reference to the fact that councils are being told they have more money to spend, while simultaneously councils across the country are having to find a collective 49% reduction in spending. Some councils having to reduce costs by tens of millions. If austerity's over, why are they then having to seek a possible 1% increase in council tax to possibly cover that deficit, which it doesn't in fact cover? Some councils will have to increase it by a fair amount more. There is an article I will go and pull up quickly. Where was it? Councillor Bird hit out the government over recent weeks as his authority is faced with saving £20 million in the next financial year and is preparing to increase council tax once again because it has had to go up a couple of times since 2010. An argument will be made about real terms and relative terms. It seems like a weird perpetual turn of phrase thing keeps coming up, and it's quite annoying. And I think if you're constantly having to say that in real terms council tax hasn't gone up, and she will say it, but it has gone up in real number, but wages haven't gone up to match it. Therefore, council tax has increased, so the cost of living has increased, and wages have not. This creates the problem where how much more can you tax families when you're still trying to find savings, it's not a new thing. And I have to state this now, it's not some innovative thing to save money by continually raising taxes or by reducing local government funding. It's not a new thing at all. It's happened all the time. It's just becoming or getting to the point where it's not as easy with a number of councils, including Walsall. Even if they did raise council tax by the amount that was okay before having to call for a referendum, which depends on the type of government, by the way. Depends on the local council. Some can only raise it by up to 3% without having to call for a referendum for the locals to then vote on it, whether they want a tax increase. We know how that goes. And others being able to increase it by 6% without having to up to 6% before calling for a referendum to vote on it. Can you imagine that? Depending on the band you live in as well. Some families paying an additional £80 a year in council tax, which doesn't sound like much. Did I say £80 a year? Yeah. Doesn't sound like much, but that £80 a year when your wages haven't gone up to match actually adds up to be quite expensive. Where was it? Oh yeah. After PMQs, Councillor Bird actually said something. He said, councils up and down the country are seeing reductions in funding to say austerity is gone in the future. It might be in the future, but at this point we're struggling to balance the books, which is true for a number of councils. I'm not going to defend Theresa May this time. I try to be a bit. I can try and see their point. But this week she says a few things that are quite frankly stupid. And I mean a special kind of stupid. Now there have been some MPs, before I continue, and I'm bleating on, that have mentioned raising council tax on the richest. There are a number of properties that get taxed, or used to get taxed, quite heavily during the time of Labour. Things called the mansion tax. Anytime someone with any money had something that was worth a lot of money, they'd get taxed a lot more to be able to have the right to have that property, essentially. And a lot of people, even myself, I took issue with that. I thought it was a punishment. Or it could be perceived as you punishing someone for succeeding. I think how we determine how someone contributes fairly to society is difficult enough. But some have suggested raising council tax on the richest. Labour's policies predominantly centre around fleecing the rich, and we'll get to those when Prime Minister Theresa May talks about costing, which we'll get to in a few questions' time.
Minister.
And I say to the right honourable gentleman, indeed, after a decade of austerity, people need to know that their hard work has paid off, and because of their sacrifices, there are better days ahead. So,
hang on, sorry, I should have read the chat. I live in a place within the top 10 council tax-paying locations, with no explanation for for culling services like libraries and arts services. Yeah. Councils need to be more open about this. There needs to be more transparency. I don't like this clandestine crap. It has... yes. Okay, so the budget comes out next week. And in it is expected... it is expected that the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, will grant an additional 1% increase in council tax to local governments. Some have additionally complained that grants will be needed to cover costs for not welfare, childcare and for housing. I believe those are the two. It's unlikely though. I don't believe he'll do the latter. I think he'll do the 1% council tax increase. I know our council tax bill went up. Viper is threatening to spank me. Then I recommend everyone in the chat call her cute, because we all know what she looks like. So do it. She's clearly fishing for it. So do it. Progressive tax rates, wonderful, and then moan about wage disparity. Then a 1% £1,000 wage increase puts you over the tax brackets, and so you receive a £28,000 increase to match effectiveness. Yeah. Also, what's DBD? Someone tell me what DBD is. I don't know what it is.
We'll be setting out our approach. We will be.
It is common for governments or shadow governments, I guess shadow cabinets, to put very far out their ideas so close to a budget. They're begging for it, so they'll make it as uncomfortable as possible. Government can then fob it off, because that's what they can do. Dead by Daylight, thank you, I don't know what that is. Oh, hang on. If Grant Haley's
setting
correct,
out our approach.
If Grant Haley's correct, you could have just written heresy.
The spending review next year. What does it mean? I'll tell you what it means. It means debt going down as a share of the economy, and support for public services going up.
Not true.
But I have to say that, unlike Labour, we will continue to live within our means, and we won't go back to square one.
If austerity is ending, why are we still doing cuts and then bragging about additional money going into it, which then sounds like we're putting more money into something that already has the already existing amount there without having to make the savings? Surely that's not making savings at all. You're balancing books, but you're balancing numbers by trying to fob it off as if you're doing better or more when you're not.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this process hasn't been very convincing to Mike Bird, the Conservative leader of Walsall Council, who says, never ever believe what you hear from central government. Austerity is not over.
Difference between central government and local government. Central government is out of touch with local government. Central government doesn't actually know how local governments work. It's surprising how central government will brag about devolved administration powers and such, but actually they don't know or care about any of it. And the Conservative Party are pretty guilty for this one. They are active in dealing with it and wanting to devolve some powers, but I think they consider local councils to be Mickey Mouse governments.
Her MPs seem to have lost a lot of confidence in her, and so have her
Yeah, there was a bit of a protest thing. I think she has since quelled that, but I don't think she's going to survive much longer, to be honest. Today, the pressure was, I thought, to the point where she would have to resign. I firmly believe she will eventually, within a year or two, because there's no way she can continue with this.
councillors as well. And not far away in Derby, the Conservative Council says financial outlook is extremely challenging.
You are quite right. Local government doesn't know how local government works. They have no idea either, but at least they are very much aware when they're told they have to make savings of tens of millions, that they're going to have to do something that will inevitably cost them their jobs. I did read up on some Conservative ones having to find savings, were bragging about supporting the Prime Minister's manifesto. But as Corbyn will mention later, unlike hers is not costed. She was never open about the numbers. It was vague, and it was a pretty piss-poor manifesto. The only manifesto I thoroughly enjoyed reading was the monster raving lunatic parties, or was it the pirate parties? One of them. It was spectacular.
With government austerity measures confirmed as continuing. Will the Prime Minister try and cheer up these gloomy Tories in Derby and confirm to them that next week the budget will cancel the £1.3 billion cut planned for local government next year?
This is quite... Obviously, sarcasm, I get it. The Derby Council, I did actually have something for that. No, that tab. Stop opening wrong tabs. Oh yeah, job losses and service cuts in an attempt to save quite a few million actually, because they need to find £12 million in cuts for 2019 to 2020, and so far they've only managed to do 4.9, which covered adult social and children's social care departments, corporate services, which was mostly car parking, and they need to find a further 5.5 before a consultation on the budget for next year begins on the 13th of December. But they are one of the local governments that are waiting for the what was it? They're waiting for the Chancellor's autumn statement, where they are hoping for a 1% increase in council tax, and the grants that I earlier mentioned about costs for adult and children's social care. Now, some of the plans to save money for Derby, including closing children's homes and 3 in-house day centres. And there are other care homes that get funding. So obviously this is pretty bad. It doesn't look good if you look at it close enough. It doesn't paint the Tories very well when they brag about putting, which you'll hear it in a minute, what Theresa May says, but it makes no sense. So if they're having to cut however many billion, well, let's just get to Theresa May and then you'll get it.
Prime Minister!
Say to the right honourable gentleman, actually we're making 1.3 billion more money available in these next 2 years to.
But if you're having to make savings of however many billion it was, how are you making 1.3 billion or 1.4 billion more? Aren't you just cancelling out the savings? Or are you actually investing 2.8 billion or whatever? This is the confusing part. You're bragging about putting money into it, but you're known to be taking money out of it at the same time. If anything, it just sounds like you're balancing a book and you're not actually investing in local government. The Green candidate. Oh dear, oh dear.
Councils, and I'm pleased to say that council tax is down in real terms since under the last Labour government.
Right, let's talk about that. Where is it? Where was it? So, I found an article from the 28th of March this year, where it said local authorities in England say they have little choice but to put up council taxes, where the average bill will be 5.1% higher in 2018 to 2019, which for a Bandy property, as I mentioned earlier, was an £81 increase. In this article, it also states that the government said council tax was lower in real terms than when Labour lost its power in 2010. But wages were higher then, in real terms. So this argument doesn't stack up for a second. The cost of living has increased. Poverty relative poverty is up as well, because of where the bar for that has gone and the fact that wages have stagnated. It's a bit of a, it's such a bad brag. It's not really a brag at all, actually. That's kind of shit, really. And I think I've got that's the best pause face for it. It sums up my frustration at realising a number of Tories, the Tory policies, aren't as clever as they try and fob it off as. I feel stupid now.
But if he wants to sort of make statements about what should be in the budget, perhaps we ought to look at his past predictions. He said that our plans would mean 1 million people losing their jobs.
Okay, we're now about to hear one of the stupidest things anyone could ever say, ever. And I'll explain why when she says it. It is one of the stupidest things you could say.
Have we seen 3.3 million more people in work?
Right. The reason this is stupid is because this is done from 2010 to now. Right, that's great and everything. But the population of those that have reached the age of 16 from 2010 to now is 3 million. The majority of those people went straight into work. The actual number of unemployed people hasn't moved much since then. It's gone down, of course, yes, with 0-hour contracts, and we'll certainly talk about those when Corbyn mentions it. But she's bragging about more people in work, but it's not really it's not as impressive as it sounds when you think the population's just increased and those who were younger are now older and just simply moved in to that age bracket. It's not impressive at all, actually. It's quite shit. Let's not forget here, and I'll mention now, 0-hour contracts, but also apprenticeships, with an increase in those. It's not... Oh, it bugged me so much. I had a source for this as well. Where's the fact-checker thing I had for it? I had this really clever thing that pointed out the retardedness. No, that's 0-hour contracts. That's PMQ. Where was it? It actually pointed out the very clever... no, it's universal credit. No, that's costing. Costing is going to come up, I promise. Both pathetic. No, that wasn't it. Oh, you bastard. Before I started this stream, Google Chrome decided to shit itself. So I had to reset it, which meant that some of the tabs I had disappeared. Oh, where is it? It bugs me so much. Oh, that's going to piss me off so much later. It had a fantastic... It showed statistics for how the population shifted over time. For those, like, for example, those going into work, but those who left work when they retired. We've got an ageing population after all, and some have retired before the age was increased. So it's quite irritating that this comment is passed off as if it's new. But it's not, because we still have a huge number of jobs available in a number of very highly skilled fields, but we are unable to plug that gap. Oh well, we'll carry on. I'm sure I'll remember the source and link it below afterwards. Get the nappies out for the Chrome. Yeah, Chrome is cancer. It actually pisses me off. I may have to stop using it because it just bugs me so much now. It takes up so much memory. Why?
He said our plans would
It might be the workforce participation report, actually. That's a good point. Thank you, Sean.
mean Greek levels of youth unemployment. And what have we seen? Youth unemployment is at a record low.
I think my earlier statement covered that quite nicely. But let's not forget here, quite a number are being forced onto work-related programs. So it's not as impressive as it sounds.
So he'll find out what's in the budget next week. But there's one thing...
But they want to know now. Pram toys thrown everywhere.
that we know for certain. Labour will still make a mess of the economy.
Yeah, these digs... They make no... Okay, so I get it. It's your job to answer the question, and then of course if you want to throw shots. But your shots have no real substance until you actually say something other than a bit of shade.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister didn't get round to mentioning the record numbers of people on 0 hours contracts.
This is true and kind of false at the same time. Okay, so it's widely known from the Office of National Statistics that yes, 0 hour contracts in the labour market rose by 100,000 last year. So they've set around about 1.8 million. They've sort of fluctuated since March 2015. They've actually come down from 2.1 million in March 2015 to now being at 1.8 million. But that's actually been changing for a reason, and it's been changing because of what was it? It was because of a government it was a low pay commission introduced so there was an independent review introduced by or commissioned by Theresa May that recommended last year that the low pay commission consider introducing a higher rate of minimum wage for 0 hours workers, and also said the government should bring forward legislation to allow agency workers on 0 hour contracts to formalise their status. Because of that, the number has kind of stayed there. It hasn't increased or decreased. It's almost stabilised in that area. Because basically the government has only committed to providing a right to request a more predictable contract. Because the government is flexing its muscles with regards to agency workers, agencies are less inclined to take more people on when they're going to request stability. And that's what's curbed the growth, which has stagnated. I will link the Office of National Statistics study on this. It is quite in depth. I'll link the actual page with the graph on, since most people aren't really interested in all the bump before and after. I love it on the article I've got here as well. The question is, I'll ask it to the chat. Should the UK legalise cannabis for medicinal purposes? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no. And 3 if you just don't give a fuck. And for those who wonder, I press 3 because I just don't care. As long as you don't blow it in my face, I have no problems with you. Blow it in my face, then I'll fucking kill you. Moving on.
The record levels. The record levels.
The 3s. I bloody well knew Joe would put 1 though. Fucking stoner.
Of in-work poverty, meaning people in work have to access a food bank.
And look, Fairy Kitten, you were right. The food bank bit came up. When people are encouraged to use a service that they would not have otherwise used, or because it's now a more commonly known service, does it really mean more people... I'm still struggling to put this thought out there. It's quite irritating. The service has been known to exist for a long time, but people didn't know about it. Different times, I guess. Maybe poor communication. The government never really backed a number of it. Quite a lot of it, for that matter. Oh, shit. Who messaged me? Fuck you, Patreon. They constantly message you. I hate them.
And wages lower in real terms than they were 8 years ago.
Constantly bragged about. The best you can say is they haven't grown. That's it. Well, they haven't grown by the same as the economic growth thing. They've been under it. I guess it's called a deficit, isn't it? Isn't it? It's austerity. Fuck it.
And that her government has cut 49% from local governments since 2010.
Exactly.
Staffordshire Police have lost 500 officers. On Sunday, the Chief Constable, Gareth Morgan, said sorry to his police colleagues and their families as they had to cancel rest days just to maintain the service.
Yeah, the Staffordshire Police, I'm not going to make excuses for the government on this one, because the police cuts are pretty obvious. The county force are going to have to cut jobs, and in order to save an estimated 6.6 million over the next 2 years. The Prime Minister is going to do this now, we all know it. She did it last week when talking about police cuts, then saying we're going to make available 450, 460, 400 and whatever million pounds, because the number has changed over PMQs. It was originally 450, but today she's going to say 460 for police forces. But as I have debunked this, it's not that, it's closer to 120, which then would have to be spread over the entire police force if they were able to access any of it at all. Just because it's made available does not mean they have access to it. Other police forces will get priority over them. So yeah, let's continue. Look, did you see that coconut?
apologise to his officers. Will the Prime Minister apologise to the police as well?
Prime Minister!
I think with all the cuts, an apology might be needed. But I don't think if she did, it would be enough for anyone. They'd want her head instead.
The right honourable gentleman, that he talks about the police and about what is available for the police. Of course, what we saw at the last election was the Labour Party saying £300 million more should be made available to the police. What we have done is made available £460 million more to 460 more pounds to the police. But can I also say to the right honourable gentleman, if he wants to talk about figures, I actually have a book here that's edited by the Shadow Chancellor.
I need to get a copy of this book, but I don't know what it is. I'm going to have to Google it after the stream and maybe read it. Maybe I'll do it as a reading. I'll find the passage she was referring to. But she hasn't tweeted it out, so I have no idea what it is. But I really, really, really want to read it. It would be like a free sedative for any and all listeners.
And in an article by an economic advisor to the Labour Party, he says about their last manifesto, the numbers did not add up. I got the page marked, that this was a welcome feature and largely irrelevant. Well, it may be irrelevant to the right honourable gentleman and the Shadow Chancellor, but it's not irrelevant to the people whose taxes go up, whose jobs are lost, and whose children have to pay Labour's debt.
So the fact checker is required for this, and I do actually have a source for it. Labour said in their manifesto that commitments were mostly paid for by taxing rises for top earners and business. Now, for most people who aren't British, or my age group anyway, you wouldn't have known during the time of Labour they introduced the 50p tax rate. This pushed businesses out of this country. They were like, fuck off. Some major sports people were making demands where the team had to cover their taxes so they would earn the amount other people in continental Europe were earning, which some could get away with because they sold enough shirts. It made some sense. Taxing the rich to the extent that Labour want to will push them out of the country. It's the same with any business. They, yes, need to be held to account, but at the same time, if you want to save money, you move your business abroad. There is an investigation going on at the moment with, I think, was it 7 Premier League clubs and 40-odd Premier League players involved in tax discrepancies. What I think's happened is they've declared themselves a business, and then they get a dividend from that to live on. I think some people get away with that, which is fine. It makes some sense because business tax is what, 21%? So if you're only paying 21% and you get a very small allowance to live on, your quid's in, really, because when you liquidate the business, they're, well, better off. The party claimed the full package of measures will bring in exactly $48.6 billion, which they need to fund their ambitious spending. As we all know, since one of those programs they want to spend on is buying back railway, which they said would cost $500 billion, yeah, no. So, one of the uncertainties comes from the Institute for Fiscal Studies that thinks Labour's assumptions are highly uncertain. Higher taxes, yes, bring in more money, but over time people tend to change their behaviour to avoid paying higher taxes. For example, they might retire earlier, shift income into pensions, or even leave the country, as I earlier stated. So as you go down the list of specific numbers, the sense of vagueness grows. Also, Labour said they will bring in an extra $6.5 billion a year by doing more to tackle tax avoidance and evasion, which is a very specific number for something that is not exactly easy to calculate. Who have you singled out to come up with that number? That is absolutely fabricated. Labour have also said that they have chosen a number that lies between the Conservatives and Labour's own commitments from the 2015 manifestos. That's their excuse. While it is true that the number does split the difference between the anti-tax avoidance, Labour doesn't mention that when the major parties came out with these figures, the IFS accused them flatly of just making the numbers up. There's also the cost of nationalisation. Labour said they want to renationalise, let's go with energy, railways, Royal Mail and water. I can support water, rail and energy, not Royal Mail. Royal Mail are shit, okay? They always were. And quite frankly, I'm okay with them not being a part of the public's property anymore. In fact, add the BBC to that and we're good. Okay? Now, they've detailed that they can be achieved, but how much it will cost is not explained at all. But we have heard from McDonnell 500 billion would be needed for rail. Let's continue. The cost of a national investment bank, where McDonnell in fact announced a pledge for a new investment bank. He said the government would supply £100 billion of borrowed money, those fucking gilts again, to float the new publicly owned banks and raise an additional £150 billion from the private sector. How? Now, in the manifesto, the bank is mentioned, not the £100 billion though. Right? Now Labour were asked about this and they said, and this is a quote, "The National Investment Bank is mainly private sector capital and some public seed capital. We are hoping to say more about this later in the campaign." You fucking what, mate? Where's the rest of it? Oh yeah, National Transformation Fund. This is one more that I think we're going to cover before we continue. They plan to pass their own test for fiscal credibility. They'll increase spending on everyday businesses of government by 48.6 billion. But it's on the long-term spending where the numbers don't really make any sense. For example, the manifesto's flagship infrastructure package is set to cost 250 billion over 10 years. The cost of this having not been published, but Labour have confirmed that the fund will be paid for by government borrowing, taking advantage of, quotes, low interest rates. But just to also point this out, Labour's manifesto also said, "We are committed to ensuring that the national debt is lower at the end of the next parliament than it is today." How can you increase borrowing but also promise to lower national debt? How? Who's waving the wand and pointing it at Jeremy's sphincter? And when someone asks which one, we all know which one. The balloon knot one. Let's continue, because basically it talks about it continues to talk about other stuff. It's just nonsense at this point.
Only one party costed their manifesto in the last election, and it wasn't the Tory party.
But as I've just said, their manifesto made no sense.
And for all she says, Mr. Speaker, for all she says about police, the reality is there are 21,000 less police officers than there were 8 years ago.
If Labour introduced Diane Abbott's policy for £300 million being invested in police officers, we'd get, what, 300 police officers? You guys have very expensive police officers. I'm just saying. Oh, look at that coconut. Sorry. I know I've been rambling a little on Labour's manifesto, but I promise I'll rail on Theresa May a little more soon.
And she should listen to the Chief Constable of the West Midlands, who says criminals are taking advantage of these cuts. And I quote, "We're struggling to deliver a service to the public."
It's actually a point I want to raise now with you all. See what you think. Crime goes up and down all the time. When we need more police officers, eventually governments kowtow and give us more police officers, because apparently that's the only deterrent we have, which appears to be more police numbers. So, do you think police are a deterrent, considering how soft our police are? Or do you believe that there is an alternative? And if so, could you tell me in the chat? Because I'm quite curious. There is a correlation between more police being present, I get it. However, this hedging your bets with simply having more police, considering the nature of the number of crimes involved, some using knives, our police officers can't deal with that. They'd have to call SWAT in for one guy with a knife. Hell, they'd call in the fucking army for a guy with a potato peeler. I wouldn't be surprised if someone ran past Buckingham Palace with a spoon. A bent spoon, no less. And the Grenadier Guard put their M4s on him. Is it M4? Yeah. Ran a bayonet through the fucker for having a bent spoon. Because he's a terrorist. Whereas with our police, they'd have to call in the Grenadier Guard because that's too much for them to handle and far too much paperwork for them to get permission to tackle the cunt with the bent spoon. Hardened punishment, not more officers. Yeah, if only prison wasn't so cushy in our country, though. That is a problem. Diane Abbott, numbers and figures, yeah. I know, it's one of the funniest things with her. When she did that on LBC, and I think she said, was it 300, I think, for 30 million? Or 300 million? That cracked me up.
I think the criminals are well aware of how stretched we are.
Yeah. They also know that we're a soft touch with prison. What do we do now? Oh, crap. There we go.
2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister told the House that people on universal credit will be...
I think we need Azkaban. I think we all do. Someone go create it and give me Dementors. Lots of Dementors. Or hipsters, whichever's easier, I guess.
Protected. The very next day, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions said some people will be worse off on universal credit. Yep. Which statement is true?
Yep. Prime Minister!
Can I remind the right honourable gentleman what I made clear to the House was that those people who are moved through the managed migration process onto universal credit will indeed have the protections of, I think it's around £3 billion of transitional protection. But let me just tell him what happens under universal credit. 200,000. Oh, the shadow foreign secretary says no, 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 because they don't want to know what happens in terms of universal credit. 200,000 more people into work. 700,000 people getting the extra money they're entitled to, and 1 million disabled households get more money.
Believe it or not, we do actually have some armed officers, but they are centralised to cities, and there aren't enough of them realistically to tackle the knife issue. I think once someone's pulled a knife out and tried to stick it in someone, you then have a very tough call. Do you try and talk that person down, or do you put a round in them, in the shoulder preferably, so that they at least live to be punished? And I think our police officers wouldn't shoot a rubber round for fear of losing their job and then summarily being sentenced for it. Our system is so soft, it's ridiculous.
Per month. We're not replicating the old system because the old system didn't work. This is a system that helps people into work and makes sure work pays.
There are quite a number of cases that would contradict what Theresa May says, but then when you say make work pay, that does imply that universal credit isn't all that great. But I have spoken to a number of people who have said universal credit is great. It's really irritating that there are so many conflicting reports about the pros and cons of it. And I hope I am never someone that has to go on it. So thankfully I have a real... well, thankfully I'm self-employed, I guess. Which is handy.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Prime Minister is completely out of touch with the reality of what
She is. Universal credit isn't working, but it is a better idea than having several different benefit systems in place, or dozens even. Especially if you go with the Labour previous government's policy of simply making it so work didn't pay at all, because you could just live cushy on government handouts for the rest of your life, which was the most inefficient, economically stupid thing you could do. It sounded like something that Diane Abbott would come up with. When there was no cap on benefits, people could claim hundreds of thousands a year. That's stupid. That really is.
Universal credit is about £50 per week worse off. Weeks waiting for the first payment when they move on to universal credit.
Yeah, I don't understand the waiting period. I do not get it at all. The worse off £50 thing, I think that's subjective. It depends on individual circumstances. I think they're basing it on a particular type of family model, but that doesn't apply to the majority of them, and obviously region and crap like that.
People going into debt, people losing their homes, people stressed out beyond belief because they can't make ends meet and having to access a food bank just...
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that people should have to live on benefits to live better than those who work. I know it's a cruel thing to say, but I shouldn't have to... No, people who are on benefits, unless they are disabled or retired, I think for the most part you shouldn't have it so good that you get to live comfortably. There is always going to be a level of stress involved when you're on benefits, because it shouldn't be more comfortable than those that work. And by the way, you're also implying that people that work aren't living under those conditions themselves, even though you have said that they do to an extent depending on their income level. But then when they reach a certain income level, you're going to punish them by saying, naughty, naughty. How dare you earn more money than everyone else? Time to take it all away from you. Yeah, it is pretty much pot kettle. Yeah, and police, honestly, the police are bent, corrupt fucks. They don't act for fear of racist calls of racism even. It's embarrassing at this point. Please check Twitter. Right. Give me a second, James. I will go to this tab here. I will pull up Twitter. It had better be something really interesting. But if it's a dick pic, I'm going to block you. Alright, notifications. Right. National Career Service. Police officers required 10,000. Minimum money needed 200 million. Money needed for maximum pay 600 million. Interesting. That is very interesting. I like that. Thank you very much for doing that. And you've linked it as well, even better. Right, yes, anyway, sorry, you had me staring at that for a second.
To feed their children. That is the reality of universal credit. Mr. Speaker, 8 years of Tory austerity means there are 40,000 nurse vacancies in the NHS. The numbers of students applying for nurse training has fallen by over 16,000 since the...
Hang on a second. I waited 20 weeks for a single payment on the previous system, resulting in 16 weeks of no... Actually, that's the point. When I was unemployed, so I can draw from experience on this as well, when I first lost my job, I had to claim housing benefit and job seekers. Job seekers was done within a couple of days, but housing benefit took 12 weeks, and they didn't backdate it, even though the claim date was there. They eventually did, but by then I had already used all my savings up to cover the cost of rent that they had stiffed me on, and no longer lived at the property. So it was nice to have the money back, but by then I'd lost my home, so it was like, what was the fucking point of that? I'm sorry you had to go through PIP. I really am. And yes, James, that actually was incredibly helpful. I really appreciate that. I will link that source in the description for those who are interested afterwards.
The cut in the nurse bursary. The Prime Minister told us...
And no, he won't get banned. It wasn't a dick pic.
Austerity is over. Will the government take the necessary step next week in the budget of restoring the nurse bursary so those who want to become nurses in our NHS can realise their ambitions?
We do need nurses, just saying.
Prime Minister!
The Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned in universal credit the wait that people have in order to get their first payment. We announced in the budget last year that we were reducing the period of time that people had to wait for their first payment. And what did the Right Honourable Gentleman and the Labour Party do?
They voted it down. And that's actually... I don't understand why. I looked around for reasons why I can't find one. I might tweet directly to a bunch of MPs, Labour ones, to give me an answer why they voted that down. But I couldn't find a reason.
They voted against that change.
Hypocrisy!
And then he talks about if there's an end to austerity, actually we should be doing more for the National Health Service. Can I remind the Right Honourable Gentleman, it is this government that has announced that we are going to be putting £394 million a week more into the National Health Service. At the last election, Labour said that with 2.2% more money into the NHS each year, it would be the envy of the world. Well, I can tell the House we're not putting 2.2% in.
This has come up many times. We're not putting 2. Honestly, this has actually come up a few times. It's quite annoying now.
We're not putting 2.5% in. We're not putting 3% in. We're putting an extra 3.4% in.
Which many believe will come courtesy of a little borrowing to match for the budget. Just saying.
A long-term plan that will deliver for people up and down this country.
Mr. Speaker, applications for nurse training dropped by 12% in September. That's the reason.
You don't suppose it's because people think it's a ridiculously stressful working environment and people don't want to be involved in it? Or do you think it's because people are choosing different career paths because we want to get them more encouraged to go towards things like STEM instead of giving a shit about other people?
Reality of taking away the nurse bursary. Yep. Those that want to become nurses cannot afford to go into debt in order to do a job they want to do, and we all need them to do. Yep. Mr. Speaker, this...
Done, James.
Government is simply not being straight with the public. They promised an end to austerity. They can't even fool...
You can't say austerity is coming to an end or imply it's coming to an end and then simultaneously call for cuts of 49% to local government. It's not. You can't claim you're investing and then also take away. That doesn't make sense.
Their own councillors. They promised the NHS an extra 20 billion. We don't know where it's coming from. Or
as far as I was aware, I think at the moment it's at about 13 billion, but it does need to get to the 20 that they're supposedly promised.
When it's coming, GP numbers falling.
And I doubt perfectly faded delusions. No, fuck it, you're mentally faded delusions now. I don't think the mental health services will get it, but I think it will get a sizable amount of the money being promised due to parity of esteem. So since we treat mental health the same as physical conditions, which is rightly so, let's face it, we are becoming more and more broken, so naturally we need to fix people up or do the best we can to treat problems and conditions. Yes. I chose STEM for the same reason, Ray. I like labs. I thoroughly enjoyed it because it meant I didn't have to interact with people. But people liked interacting with me, and that pissed me off. Apparently I was a bit like Jack D, but I don't get that joke. They can all fucking do one.
Health visitor numbers falling and nurse numbers falling also. They promised universal credit would protect everyone. The Work and Pension Secretary let the cat out of the bag. People will be worse off. The Prime Minister claimed she's ending austerity. So will she confirm that in next week's budget there will be...
Why bother asking questions like that when you know she won't answer it? in the sense that there's no point in her announcing it if the budget's going to come out. You just want to read it before it's out. You'll get to read it, by the way, he will, an hour or so before the budget's given, because they're allowed an advanced copy to then, scrutinise it and make a statement of their own, which will be interesting.
More police on our streets, more nurses in our hospital, and elderly people in desperate need of care will not go ignored and forgotten by her government.
The right honourable gentleman. What have we seen under this government? We've seen more money.
That's okay, Ghost Poo is important. I'll be finishing soon anyway. Once she gives her answer, because there's something she'll say that I do want to talk about briefly before we conclude.
Being available to the police, we've seen more money for the health service, more money for social care, more money going into local authorities, more money going into our schools. And at the end of this Parliament, we'll be spending £500 million more in real terms on people of working age and children in our welfare system. But let's actually look at what we now know about what the Labour Party's alternative is. Because we now see, as reported by a respected academic, that by their own admission, Labour's plans would cost £1,000 billion. Wow. That's the equivalent.
Does anyone know what 1,000 billion is? There is a word for it, but for some reason it sounds more impressive to say 1,000 billion as opposed to, and I'll let you in the chat say it, it's pretty fucking obvious.
Of £35,000 for every household in this country. We know what that would mean. Higher debt, higher taxes, fewer jobs. Labour just taking us back to square one.
Right, so I'm not going to do the S&P questions because it's about Saudi Arabia, and quite frankly it's cringe. I will address it without actually doing the questions, but I will address the comment £35,000 per household in the United Kingdom. That's a number that was going on Twitter. People were bleating on about it, saying where she got this number from. And yes, trillion. That's the word. People were talking about how on earth did she come up with the number of £35,000 for every household. Well, very simple mathematics. £35,000 for roughly... Okay, so she's off by about 50 billion. But there are 27.2 million households in this country. If every household is paying 35 grand to fund Labour's policies of buying back services and investing in them, quotes, investing in them, it comes to about 945 billion, which is ridiculous. Can you imagine that? You've just come into government and your first policy is to spend 945 billion of money that we don't have by borrowing, gilts. Lots and lots of gilts. Who the fuck is going to buy those? It will eventually cost, because then we have a budget deficit from interest we're having to pay off, and it's just not going to work. Quite frankly, it's a joke. Now to the S&P. They talk about the recent assassination of somebody at the Turkish embassy, and Saudi Arabia and us trading with them. Theresa May will then spoke about how we have very strict rules on who they can and cannot use the weapons on and such. So there is accountability and there are rules about what they do, and if they do something that breaks certain terms, they get nothing and they lose out. But that doesn't seem to be enough for Ian Blackford, who seems to be on this moral crusade of wanting to know the culprit of this assassination. Problem is, his solution would essentially want, us to investigate it? Because that's the only way we'll ever get the, quotes, truth. It happened in Turkey, one of the shadiest countries on the planet. Erdogan is calling them out. You know you fucked up, by the way, when Erdogan, or whatever his fucking name is calling you out. Now, granted, he has issues with the Saudi king, or whatever the twat is in charge. He has issues with them. But quite frankly, it's a shit show. A billion. Yeah. Anyway, because Ghost Poo's on and I want to rest, I'm going to leave this here. Thank you all very much for joining me. If you enjoyed it, please slap a like. If you didn't, do it anyway. And have a lovely... fuck off, I'm not pronouncing that, Trups. We're back here tomorrow with Trups, actually, doing a political recap, provided he's not doing anything. So I'll speak to you all then. Bye-bye.